color field painting is a style of abstract painting that emerged in New York City during the 1940s and 1950s. It was inspired by European modernism and closely related to Abstract Expressionism, while many of its notable early proponents were among the pioneering Abstract Expressionists. Color field is characterized primarily by large fields of flat, solid color spread across a stained into the canvas, creating areas of unbroken surface on a flat picture plane. The movement places less emphasis on gesture, brushstrokes and action in favor of an overall consistency of form and process. In color field painting, color is freed from objective context and becomes the subject in itself. During the late 1950s and 1960s, color field paint has emerged in Great Britain, Canada, Washington, D.C. and the west coast of the United States, using formats of stripes, targets, simple geometric patterns and references to landscape imagery and to nature. Historical roots. The focus of attention in the world of contemporary art began to shift from Paris to New York after World War II and the development of American Abstract Expressionism. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, Clement Greenberg was the first art critic to suggest and identify a dichotomy between differing tendencies within the abstract expressionist canon, taking issue with Harold Rosenberg, who wrote The Virtues of Action Painting in his famous article American Action Painters, published in the December 1952 issue of Art News. Greenberg observed another tendency toward all-over color, a color field in the works of several of the so-called first-generation abstract expressionists. Mark Rothko was one of the painters that Greenberg referred to as a color field painter, exemplified by magenta, black, green on orange, although Rothko himself refused to adhere to any label. For Rothko, color was merely an instrument. Quote, in a sense, his best-known works, the Multiforms, and his other signature paintings, are, in essence, the same expression, albeit one of purer means, which is that of the same basic human emotions as his earlier surrealistic mythological paintings. What is common among these stylistic innovations is a concern for tragedy, ecstasy, and doom. By 1958, whatever spiritual expression Rothko meant to portray on canvas, it was growing increasingly darker. His bright reds, yellows and oranges of the early 1950s utterly transformed into dark blues, greens, grays and blacks. His final series of paintings from the mid-1960s were gray and black with white borders, seemingly abstract landscapes of an endless, bleak, tundra-like, unknown country. Rothko, during the mid-1940s, was in the middle of a crucial period of transition, and he had been impressed by Clifford Still's abstract fields of color, which were influenced in part by the landscapes of Still's native North Dakota. In 1947, during a subsequent semester teaching at the California School of Fine Art, Rothko and Still flirted with the idea of founding their own curriculum at school. Still was considered one of the foremost color field painters. His non-figurative paintings are largely concerned with the juxtaposition of different colors and surfaces. His jagged flashes of color give the impression that one layer of color has been torn off the painting, revealing the colors underneath, reminiscent of stalactites and primordial caverns. Still's arrangements are irregular, jagged, and pitted with heavy texture and sharp surface contrast, the scene above in 1957D1. Another artist whose best-known works relate to both abstract expressionism and to color field painting is Robert Motherwell. Motherwell's style of abstract expressionism, characterized by loose open fields of painterless surfaces accompanied by loosely drawn and measured lines and shapes, was influenced by both Joan Miro and by Henri Matisse. Robert Motherwell's elegy to the Spanish Republic No. 110 is the work of a pioneer of both abstract expressionism and color field painting. Robert Motherwell's Elegy to the Spanish Republic series embodies both tendencies, while Motherwell's open series of the late 1960s, 1970s and 1980s places him firmly within the color field camp. In 1970, Motherwell said, "Throughout my life, the 20th century painter whom I've admired the most has been Matisse," alluding to several of his own series of paintings that reflect Matisse's influence, most notably his open series that come closest to classic color field painting. Barnett Newman is considered one of the major figures in abstract expressionism and one of the foremost of the color field painters. Newman's mature work is characterized by areas of color pure and flat separated by thin vertical lines, or zips as Newman called them, exemplified by ver heroicus sublimus in the collection of MoMA. Newman himself thought that he reached his fully mature style with the ornament series seen here. The zips define the spatial structure of the painting while simultaneously dividing and uniting the composition. Although Newman's paintings appear to be purely abstract, many of them were originally untitled. The names he later gave them hinted at specific subjects being addressed, often with a Jewish theme. Two paintings from the early 1950s, for example, are called Adam and Eve, and there are also Uriel and Abraham, a very dark painting, which, in addition to being the name of a biblical patriarch, was also the name of Newman's father, who had died in 1947. Newman's late works, such as the Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow and Blue series, use vibrant pure colors, often on very large canvases. Jackson Pollock, Adolph Gottlieb, Hans Hofmann, Barnett Newman, Clifford Still, Mark Rothko, Robert Motherwell, Ad Reinhardt and Arshile Gorky were among the prominent abstract expressionist painters that Greenberg identified as being connected to color field painting in the 1950s and 1960s. Although Pollock is closely associated with action painting because of his style, technique, and his painterly touch and his physical application of paint, art critics have likened Pollock to both action painting and color field painting. Another critical view advanced by Clement Greenberg connects Pollock's Alava canvases to the large-scale water lilies of Claude Monet done during the 1920s. Greenberg, art critic Michael Fried, and others have observed that the overall feeling in Pollock's most famous works, his drip paintings, read as vast fields of built-up linear elements, often reading as vast complexes of similar valued paint skeins that read as all-over fields of color and drawing, and are related to the mural-sized late monuments that are constructed of many passages of close-valued brushed and scumbled marks that also read as close-valued fields of color and drawing that Monet used in building his picture surfaces. Pollock's use of all-over composition lend a philosophical and a physical connection to the way the color field painters like Newman, Rothko and Still construct their unbroken and, in Still's case, broken surfaces. In several paintings that Pollock painted after his classic drip painting period of 1947 to 1950, he used the technique of staining fluid oil paint and house paint into raw canvas. During 1951 he produced a series of semi-figurative black stain paintings, and in 1952 he produced stain paintings using color. In his November 1952 exhibition at the Sidney Janis Gallery in New York City, Pollock showed number 12, 1952, a large, masterful stain painting that resembles a brightly colored stained landscape. The painting was acquired from the exhibition by Nelson Rockefeller for his personal collection. In 1960 the painting was severely damaged by fire in the governor's mansion in Albany that also severely damaged an Arshile Gorky painting and several other works in the Rockefeller collection. However, by 1999 it had been restored and was installed in Albany Mall. While Arshile Gorky is considered to be one of the founding fathers of abstract expressionism and a surrealist, he was also one of the first painters of the New York school who used the technique of staining. Gorky created broad fields of vivid, open, unbroken color that he used in many of his paintings as grounds. In Gorky's most effective and accomplished paintings between the years 1941 to 1948, he consistently used intense stained fields of color, often letting the paint run and drip under and around his familiar lexicon of organic and biomorphic shapes and delicate lines. Another abstract expressionist whose works in the 1940s called to mind the stain paintings of the 1960s and the 1970s is James Brooks. Brooks regularly used stain as a technique in his paintings from the late 1940s. Brooks began diluting his oil paint in order to have fluid colors with which to pour and drip and stain into the mostly raw canvas that he used. These works often combined calligraphy and abstract shapes. During the final 3 decades of his career, Sam Francis's style of large-scale bright abstract expressionism was closely associated with color field painting. His paintings straddled both camps within the abstract expressionist rubric, action painting and color field painting. Having seen Jackson Pollock's 1951 paintings of thinned black oil paint stained into raw canvas, Helen Frankenthaler began to produce stained paintings in varied oil colors on raw canvas in 1952. Her most famous painting from that period is Mountains and Sea. She is one of the originators of the color field movement that emerged in the late 1950s. Frankenthaler also studied with Hans Hofmann. Hofmann's paintings are a symphony of color as seen in The Gate, 1959-1960. Hoffmann was renowned not only as an artist but also as a teacher of art, both in his native Germany and later in the U.S. Hans Hofmann, who came to the United States from Germany in the early 1930s, brought with him the legacy of modernism. Hoffmann was a young artist working in Paris who painted before World War I. Hoffmann worked in Paris with Robert Delaunay, and he knew firsthand the innovative work of both Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse. Matisse's work had an enormous influence on him, and on his understanding of the expressive language of color and the potentiality of abstraction. Hoffmann was one of the first theorists of color field painting, and his theories were influential to artists and to critics, particularly to Clement Greenberg, as well as to others during the 1930s and 1940s. In 1953, Morris Louis and Kenneth Noland were both profoundly influenced by Helen Frankenthaler's stain paintings after visiting her studio in New York City. Returning to Washington, D.C., they began to produce the major works that created the color field movement in the late 1950s. In 1972, then Metropolitan Museum of Art curator Henry Geldzahler said, Clement Greenberg included the work of both Morris Louis and Kenneth Noland in a show that he did at the Coutts Gallery in the early 1950s. Clem was the first to see the potential. He invited them up to New York in 1953, I think it was, to Helen's studio to see a painting that she had just done called Mountains and Sea, a very, very beautiful painting, which was in a sense out of Pollock and out of Gorky. It also was one of the first stain pictures, one of the first large field pictures in which the stain technique was used, perhaps the first one. Louise and Noland saw the picture unrolled on the floor of her studio and went back to Washington, D.C., and worked together for a while, working at the implications of this kind of painting. Morris Louis' painting Where 1960 was a major innovation that moved abstract expressionist painting forward in a new direction toward color field and minimalism. Among Louis' major works are his various series of color field paintings. Some of his best-known series are the unfolds, the veils, the florals and the stripes or pillars. From 1929 to 1933, Louis studied at the Maryland Institute of Fine and Applied Arts. He worked at various odd jobs to support himself while painting, and in 1935 was president of the Baltimore Artists Association. From 1936 to 1940, he lived in New York and worked in the easel division of the Works Progress Administration Federal Art Project. During this period, he knew Arshile Gorky, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and Jack Twerkoff, returning to Baltimore in 1940. In 1948, he started to use Magna oil-based acrylic paints. In 1952, Louis moved to Washington, D.C. Living in Washington, D.C., somewhat apart from the New York scene and working almost in isolation, he and a group of artists that included Kenneth Noland were central to the development of color field painting. The basic point about Louis' work and that of other color field painters, sometimes known as the Washington Color School in contrast to most of the other new approaches of the late 1950s and early 1960s, is that they greatly simplified the idea of what constitutes the look of a finished painting. Kenneth Noland, working in Washington, D.C., was also a pioneer of the color field movement in the late 1950s who used series as important formats for his paintings. Some of Noland's major series were called targets, chevrons and stripes. Noland attended the experimental Black Mountain College and studied art in his home state of North Carolina. Noland studied with Professor Ilya Bolitovsky, who introduced him to neoplasticism and the work of Pete Mondrian. He also studied Bauhaus theory and color with Joseph Albers, and he became interested in Paul Klee, specifically his sensitivity to color. In 1948 and 1949 he worked with Ossip Zadkine in Paris, and in the early 1950s met Morris Louis in Washington, D.C. In 1970, art critic Clement Greenberg said, "I'd place Pollock along with Hoffman and Morris Louis in this country among the very greatest painters of this generation. I actually don't think there was anyone in the same generation in Europe quite to match them." Pollock didn't like Hoffman's paintings. He couldn't make them out. He didn't take the trouble to, and Hoffman didn't like Pollock's Oliver paintings, nor could most of Pollock's artist friends make head or tail out of them, the things he did from 1947 to 50. But Pollock's paintings live or die in the same context as Rembrandt's or Titian's or Velázquez's or Goya's or David's or Manet's or Rubens or Michelangelo's paintings. There's no interruption, there's no mutation here. Pollock asked to be tested by the same eye that could see how good Raphael was when he was good or Piero when he was good. Color field movement. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, young artists began to break away stylistically from abstract expressionism, experimenting with new ways of making pictures, and new ways of handling paint and color. In the early 1960s, several and various new movements in abstract painting were closely related to each other, and superficially were categorized together, although they turned out to be profoundly different in the long run. Some of the new styles and movements that appeared in the early 1960s as responses to abstract expressionism were called Washington Color School, hard edge painting, geometric abstraction, minimalism, and color field. Gene Davis also was a painter known especially for paintings of vertical stripes of color, like Black Gray Beat, 1964, and he also was a member of the group of abstract painters in Washington, D.C. during the 1960s known as the Washington Color School. The Washington painters were among the most prominent of the mid-century color field painters. The artists associated with the color field movement during the 1960s were moving away from gesture and angst in favor of clear surfaces and gestalt. During the early to mid-1960s, color field painting was the term for the work of artists like Anne Truitt, John McLaughlin, Sam Francis, Sam Gilliam, Thomas Downing, Ellsworth Kelly, Paul Feely, Friedel de Zubas, Jack Bush, Howard Merring, Gene Davis, Mary Pinchot Meyer, Jules Ilitsky, Kenneth Noland, Helen Frankenthaler, Robert Goodnow, Ray Parker, Al Held, Emerson Wofer, David Simpson, and others whose works were formerly related to second-generation abstract expressionism, and also to younger artists like Larry Poons, Ronald Davis, Larry Zox, John Hoyland, Walter Darby Bannard and Frank Stella. All were moving in a new direction away from the violence and anxiety of action painting toward a new and seemingly calmer language of color. Although color field is associated with Clement Greenberg, Greenberg actually preferred to use the term post-painterly abstraction. In 1964, Clement Greenberg curated an influential exhibition that traveled the country called Post-Painterly Abstraction. The exhibition expanded the definition of color field painting. Color field painting clearly pointed toward a new direction in American painting, away from abstract expressionism. In 2007, curator Karen Wilkin curated an exhibition called Color as Feel, American Painting 1950 to 1975 that traveled to several museums throughout the United States. The exhibition showcased several artists representing two generations of color field painters. In 1970, painter Jules Ilitsky said, "I don't know what color field painting means. I think it was probably invented by some critic, which is okay, but I don't think the phrase means anything. Color field painting. I mean, what is color? Painting has to do with a lot of things. Color is among the things it has to do with. It has to do with surface. It has to do with shape. It has to do with feelings which are more difficult to get at." Jack Bush was a Canadian abstract expressionist painter, born in Toronto, Ontario in 1909. He was a member of Painters 11, the group founded by William Ronald in 1954 to promote abstract painting in Canada, and was soon encouraged in his art by the American art critic Clement Greenberg. With encouragement from Greenberg, Bush became closely tied to two movements that grew out of the efforts of the abstract expressionists: color field painting and lyrical abstraction. His painting Big A is an example of his color field paintings of the late 1960s. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, Frank Stella was a significant figure in the emergence of minimalism, post-painterly abstraction and color field painting. His shaped canvases of the 1960s, like Hara 2, 1967, revolutionized abstract painting. One of the most important characteristics of Stella's paintings is his use of repetition. His black pinstripe paintings of 1959 startled and shocked an art world that was unused to seeing monochromatic and repetitive images, painted flat, with almost no inflection. During the early 1960s, Stella made several series of notched aluminum paintings and shaped copper paintings before making multicolored and asymmetrical shaped canvases of the late 1960s. Frank Stella's approach and relationship to color field painting was not permanent or central to his creative output, as his work became more and more three-dimensional after 1980. In the late 1960s, Richard I. Bencorn began his Ocean Park series, created during the final 25 years of his career, and they are important examples of color field painting. The Ocean Park series exemplified by Ocean Park No. 129. P connects his earlier abstract expressionist works with color field painting. During the early 1950s, Richard Diebenkorn was known as an abstract expressionist, and his gestural abstractions were close to the New York school in sensibility but firmly based in the San Francisco abstract expressionist sensibility, a place where Clifford still has a considerable influence on younger artists by virtue of his teaching at the San Francisco Art Institute. By the mid-1950s, Richard Diebenkorn, along with David Park, Elmer Bischoff and several others, formed the Bay Area Figurative School with a return to figurative painting. During the period between the fall 1964 and the spring of 1965, Diebenkorn traveled throughout Europe. He was granted a cultural visa to visit and view Henri Matisse paintings in important Soviet museums. He traveled to the then Soviet Union to study Henri Matisse paintings in Russian museums that were rarely seen outside of Russia. When he returned to painting in the Bay Area in mid-1965, his resulting works summed up all that he had learned from his more than a decade as a leading figurative painter. When in 1967 he returned to abstraction, his works were parallel to movements like the color field movement and lyrical abstraction, but he remained independent of both. During the late 1960s, Larry Poons, whose earlier dot paintings were associated with op art, began to produce looser and more free-formed paintings that were referred to as his lozenge ellipse paintings of 1967–1968. Along with John Hoyland, Walter Darby Bannard, Larry Zox, Ronald Davis, Ronnie Landfield, John Seary, Pat Lipsky, Dan Christensen and several other young painters, a new movement that related to color field painting began to form, eventually called lyrical abstraction. The late 1960s saw painters turning to surface inflection, deep space depiction, and painterly touch and paint handling merging with the language of color. Among a new generation of abstract painters who emerged combining color field painting with expressionism, the older generation also began infusing new elements of complex space and surface into the works. By the 1970s, Poons created thick-skinned, cracked and heavy paintings referred to as elephant skin paintings, while Christensen sprayed loops, colored webs of lines and calligraphy across multicolored fields of delicate grounds. Ronnie Landfield stained band paintings are reflections of both Chinese landscape painting and the color field idiom, and John Seary stained painting is exemplified by East, 1973, from the National Gallery of Australia. Poons, Christensen, Davis, Landfield, Seary, Lipsky, Zox and several others created paintings that bridge color field painting with lyrical abstraction and underscore a re-emphasis on landscape, gesture and touch.